She came to the trading post in a dress she hadn't chosen, and shoes too fine for the road. They'd once been white, all lace and pearl buttons, but now the hem was black with the clay of 2 counties and the sweat of a frightened girl. They called her bride, but no one had asked her if she wanted to be one. Her name was Eliza Carr, though her new folk would have buried that under her husband's name if the papers had been signed. She'd run before the parson finished his last blessing, slipping out the side door like a ghost fleeing a cold church. The man who paid for her silk gloves would hunt her for the stain she'd made on his pride. At dawn, the desert turned her veil to a flag of surrender. She tore it off on the 3rd day. Her hair nodded in the wind, strands sticking to the dried salt on her cheeks. Somewhere behind her was the ranch house with too many locked doors. Somewhere ahead was the faint promise that someone might forget her name if she could just cross the dry basin before they found her. The trading post rose like a lie in the sand whitewashed boards, a rusted sign that read Silver Jack's Goods and Tonics, though Jack had been dead 6 winters. A boy ran it now, a wiry shadow of a thing with big ears and one green eye clouded white from the pox. He didn't ask questions when she staggered to the door. Inside, the room smelled of kerosene and old beans. The boy gave her water in a dented tin cup. She drank until she felt her belly swell against the too-tight corset. Her throat was raw, her lips split wide enough to bleed every time they moved. She tried to ask for more, but the words stuck behind her teeth. She heard the boy's breath catch a quick, panicked sound, then boots outside. 4 pairs? Maybe 5? Spurs, clicking like bone chimes in a graveyard breeze. She didn't need to look. She could smell them horses, sweat, the sour stink of cheap whiskey. The men who owned her fate had found the trail. Eliza pressed her back to a stack of burlap sacks. She touched the chain around her neck, a gold locket that felt colder than any bullet. Inside it was a lock of her mother's hair. She wondered if her mother would forgive her for being born so soft, for letting herself be bought like cattle, for running too late. When the door swung wide, sunlight cut the room like a knife. Dust rose from the warped floorboards. 5 shadows filled the threshold. The tallest one laughed when he saw her curled against the wall. "Well, look here," he said. His voice was all oil and sour breath. Bride thought she could hide. He stepped forward, spurs scraping sparks off the floor. She pressed her palms to the sackcloth, wishing it was stone, wishing she could sink into it, wishing she'd stayed in the dark long enough to become dust herself. But then a shape behind the men, a darker shape in the brightness, silent, watching, and then moving, quick and sure as a rattler, striking the heel of a careless man. They did not see him until he was already among them. A hand on the tall man's collar, a grunt, the crunch of bone, boots tangled. Dust rose again, thicker than before, and Eliza, half dreaming, heard the voice for the first time low, clear, threaded with thunder, and the old sadness of hills that remember too much. "Mine now," he said. And the trading post became a place where her story bent, not broke. When the dust settled in that sun-blasted shack, Eliza lay there half-slumped against the feed sacks, her vision a restless fog of sweat and sudden quiet. The men were on the floor now, 4, crawling, one still as driftwood. The boy with the cloudy eye had disappeared through the back, smart enough to run when death walked in on moccasins. The man who'd come for her did not look like any man she'd ever seen up close. The townsfolk called them Apaches-like, a curse on their tongue, as if the word itself might raise ghosts from dry gullies. But to Eliza, half-conscious and half-saved, he looked like something older than words. He moved without a shadow, or maybe the shadow clung to him so tight the light could never catch it. He wore a coat of battered buckskin, dark from age and use, beadwork loose at the shoulders. His hair, black and straight, was tied back with a strip of rawhide. Around his throat hung a small circle of white shell, no larger than a thumbprint, and it glowed pale against the deep copper of his skin. In his hand, a hunting knife slick with what he'd taken back her freedom, paid in another man's blood. She heard the whimper of one of the ranchmen, the tallest one, Tom Dawes, she remembered now. The foreman who'd winked at her like he owned her skin held his jaw like it might slide off his face. He spat a tooth on the floorboards and tried to stand. The Apache kicked him in the chest. Dawes folded like spoiled leather, coughed wetly, and stayed there. The man turned to her then, and the room seemed to shrink, until it was only the two of them, her breath, shallow as a dying bird's, and his, slow as winter's promise. "You stand?" he asked her. The words shaped roughly but clear. His voice held no pity, only the steady weight of expectation, the same as a mountain waiting for the storm. Eliza tried. Her legs trembled, useless beneath the ruined silken petticoat. She pressed a palm to the wall, but the bones in her wrist felt brittle as a dried twig. The floor tilted. She swayed. He crossed the space in 2 steps, lifted her up as if she were no heavier than an empty saddlebag. She felt the roughness of the buckskin on her cheek, the faint warmth of blood on his sleeve. She should have been afraid he was stranger, danger, the ghost story whispered over fences at dusk, but fear had drained from her, spent somewhere along the dusty miles she'd stumbled to reach this last outpost. Behind his shoulder, she glimpsed the ranchmen dragging themselves out the door, leaving blood and pride in their wake. One looked back, eyes round and shining with rage, and something smaller, cowardice maybe, or that same brittle shame she'd once tasted on her wedding day. The Apache watched them go, unbothered. When they were gone, he shifted her higher in his arms, as if testing her weight against the long road ahead. He spoke again, a whisper close to her ear, meant only for her. "Bad men come again," he said. "You stay, you die." His English was halting, but the meaning fit tight in her chest. She turned her face, felt the scratch of his braids against her temple. Where do we go?" she rasped. He didn't answer with words. He stepped out into the blinding sun, the smell of horse sweat and iron blood trailing behind them. Over his shoulder, she saw the old rope sign swinging above the door, silverjacks.com, a place for trade and barter, a place where men bought, sold, and lost. He shifted her weight, and she felt the locket against her breastbone, her mother's hair, her own past, all tangled up in that tiny gold coffin. The trading post faded behind them. Ahead lay only sky so wide it made promises she didn't yet dare believe. They rode north by northwest, cutting through the sagebrush and dry riverbeds, while the sun bled itself empty across the horizon. He placed her on the back of a small roan mare, lean but sturdy, with a coat dulled by dust and a mane tangled with burrs. He walked beside her, leading the reins with a grip that never once tugged too hard. He did not ride, not yet, as if staying beside her grounded something that might slip loose if he mounted up and vanished ahead. Eliza drifted in and out. She remembered flashes, the clap of hoofbeats, the smell of sweat and horsehide, the dry rasp of his voice when she slumped too far to one side. "Hold, woman, hold." When the night finally swallowed the desert, he stopped beneath a stand of broken pinyon trees, branches twisted like gnarled fingers against the bruised black sky. He helped her down, not gently, not cruelly, just enough that her feet found dirt instead of air. When she staggered, he caught her elbow and lowered her to sit on a flattish rock. The desert cold crept in where the day's heat abandoned them. Her dress, sweat-soaked at noon, clung to her skin now like a shroud. He busied himself with the business of survival, unsaddling the horse, gathering wood, striking flint until sparks danced like fireflies around their feet. The first flames flickered, small and stubborn in the wind. She watched him feed it with dried brush and brittle branches until it snapped to life, throwing shadows against his cheekbones, angles carved hard by sun and wind, and something older than the years on his face. When the fire caught, he squatted beside it and unwrapped a scrap of cloth from his belt. Inside, strips of dried meat, a chunk of stale bread, a small twist of salt. He offered her the meat first. She stared at it, her stomach knotting against the thought of chewing, swallowing, keeping anything down after days of fear. "Eat," he said, voice low, final. "You fall if you don't." So she did, tearing the sinewy strip with teeth still gritty from the desert. Each swallow burned her throat raw, but warmth pooled in her belly, chasing back the cold that had settled deep in her bones. He ate too, but sparingly, his eyes always drifting past her shoulder to the darkness beyond the fire's circle. When he spoke again, it was not a question, more like a truth laid flat between them. "Men come by sunrise." She flinched. Her hands clutched at the thin fabric of her dress, pressing the grit deeper into her palms. "They'll kill you," she whispered, voice cracked as old parchment. "They'll kill you for this." A small sound came from him, something almost like amusement, or maybe just the echo of some memory she'd never be given. He reached into the firelight, picked up a half-burnt stick, and with it stirred the coals until sparks rose like tiny ghosts. "Men try," he said, many times. She did not know his name. She realized then how many names had been forced on her: Miss Carr, Mrs. Howell, the bride, the runaway, but the man beside her spoke no name for himself. He was just there, stone, wind, and the line between her and the ones who would drag her back in ropes. At the edge of the fire's reach, the old locket pressed cold against her chest. Her mother's hair, golden once, now brown and curled in on itself like a secret. She wondered if her mother would have sat like this once, staring at a man who owed her nothing, hoping that in his silence she might find the shape of something like mercy. The wind pushed the flames sideways, sending embers drifting into the black. The Apache watched her through the shifting shadows, eyes steady, voice soft but carrying. "Sleep, I watch." She wanted to ask, "Why me?" but the words stayed trapped behind her teeth, same as always. So she curled on the cold ground, one side warm from the fire, the other numb from the desert wind. And when sleep finally came, she dreamed of rope fibers burning, turning to ash that the wind carried far, far away. Eliza woke to dawn, cracking pale over the hills, the cold biting her cheeks harder than any slap she'd ever earned. The fire was just embers now, orange coals glowing under the ash like an old man's dying eyes. Beside her, where he'd kept watch, there was only a dent in the dirt and the quiet echo of where he'd been. Her heart clutched for a moment, foolish panic that he'd gone, taken her escape with him, left her in a desert she could not read like he did. But then a soft snort behind the pinyon trees told her he hadn't gone far. She sat up, joints stiff as old fence posts, and saw him kneeling by the roan mare, binding up the saddle with that same silent precision. His back was turned, hair loose down his shoulders now, black as crow feathers. There was something painted on the dirt between them, a symbol he'd scratched with the butt of his knife, a circle split by two lines, simple but certain. She didn't know what it meant, but it looked deliberate, a mark left for her to see. She dragged herself closer, each step pulling twigs and thorns against her stockings. When he noticed her looking, he swept his palm across the mark, erasing it like a secret too heavy for the waking world. "Eat," he said, without looking up. He jerked his chin toward a cloth bundle left near the coals, more dried meat, a strip of prickly pear, cool from the night. She knelt, bones popping, and ate because he told her to, and because she knew by now he did not waste words on things that didn't matter. When she asked her first real question, her voice barely pushed past the wind. "What do they call you?" He cinched the saddle straps tight, checked the bridle. Only then did he meet her eyes, his face still carved from that same patient rock. But his eyes carried dawn in them, a soft thing behind flint. "Nantan," he said, "means leader." Sometimes. She let the name roll around her mouth, dry as it was. Nantan. Not Mr., not Sir, not a name that came with a deed or title, just a shape of breath that fit him. He glanced toward the east, the road they'd left behind. Dust curled there, a thread rising under the new sun. "They come," he said, voice like gravel turned by a boot heel. A cold coil twisted in her belly. She touched the chain at her throat. Silver Jacks had taught her how small she was, how fast she could be cornered. But here, in this space between sunrise and flight, something flickered in her chest, a reckless spark. "They'll take me," she said, half to him, half to herself. "They'll brand me worse than any cattle if they catch me again." Nantan tilted his head. He walked back to the fire's edge, stirred the coals with a branch until they flared soft orange. Then he picked up a broken horseshoe, rusted, left behind by some passing trader, and pressed it into the heart of the embers. She watched the metal glow, slow but certain. Her mouth went dry. The last ranch she'd fled had threatened the same, a mark to keep her in her place, a symbol on flesh that said owned. It rose in her mind. Hot iron on soft skin, the stench of burning hair, a lifetime of sleeves pulled low. But then Nantan pulled it free, lifted the red iron high and threw it into the dirt at her feet. The brand hissed against the earth, steaming, then lay still, a useless ring of iron, no master left to hold it. He ground it deeper with the heel of his boot. "No mark," he said, voice flat as a stone. "Not yours." A wind curled through the pinyon branches, carrying ash and the faint smell of old iron. Eliza stared at the broken brand, half buried in the dirt. It was not on her. It never would be. Somewhere behind them, hoofbeats drummed the rising sun awake. She rose to her feet, as ready as she could be. They rode hard before the sun cleared the tops of the red hills, the wind lifting Eliza's tangled hair and scraping her cheeks raw. The roan mare's hooves drummed a steady prayer into the dry ground. Live, live, live. Nantan rode beside her now, astride a black gelding he'd found tethered near the trading post that night, stolen without ceremony. His face stayed turned to the trail ahead, but every mile he checked the horizon behind them, a flick of his eyes, a shift of his jaw. He knew the shape of men coming to claim what they thought was theirs. They crossed an arroyo still wet from last week's storm. In the shallow trickle of water, Eliza saw her reflection for the first time in days, dirt caked on her cheekbones, lips split open like a secret told too late, the silk dress in shreds that no wedding ring would ever mend. She wanted to feel shame for how ruined she looked, but that part of her had burned back with the brand in the dirt. By mid-morning, they reached a line of cottonwoods, huddled near an old mission ruin. Clay walls collapsed, roof long stolen by storms and scavengers. Here, Nantan pulled them to a halt. He swung off the gelding in one motion, silent as a falling star. "Water the horse," he told her, voice flat but not unkind. He led the mare to the stream where the water pooled clearer between rocks. Eliza slipped down, boots sinking into soft mud. She cupped her hands, let the water wash the grit from her palms, then offered it to the roan's cracked lips. When she turned, she saw him crouched at the mission wall, fingers tracing faded paint, old prayers in a tongue neither of them spoke. A rosary lay buried under the crumbled adobe, half exposed like a bone in the dust. He turned it over once, twice, then set it back in the shadow of the ruin. "How far?" she asked him, because the silence pressed on her chest worse than any saddle cinch. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past her to the cottonwoods, to the arroyo beyond. And she knew he was counting riders by the sound of crows lifting off their branches, the hush in the wind when hoofbeats muffled the dirt. He stood, reached for her arm not roughly, but firm enough that she felt how easily he could break her free from the ground or pin her to it if he chose. He guided her to the far side of the ruin, where shadows swallowed them from the road's view. "They come," he said, eyes level with hers. "You quiet." She nodded, chest hammering, the locket pressed cold above her ribs. She clutched it once for luck or for her mother's ghost, then let it fall. Voices drifted through the trees, men cursing at brambles, spitting on dry roots, barking orders at each other like hounds snapping at scraps. She pressed back against the clay wall, its rough surface catching her torn dress. They passed so close she could hear Dawes' voice, that oil-slick tone she'd first heard at the trading post. "She's here, trail's fresh. Little bitch thinks she can hide behind red-skinned ghosts." A hush then broken by a softer sound. Hooves again, but slower. A mule's bray. And then a child's giggle. Small, bright as birdsong. The men's curses stumbled, startled. A little boy stood in the sunlit clearing, hair sticking up like a tufted quail. Bare feet muddy, eyes wide as a dawn sky. He must have been from the mission's ghost village, one of the few who still scraped corn and water from these dead hills. He pointed at Dawes, grinned, and in his bright voice, clear enough to split the hush, he shouted, "Bad man? Mama says you bad man?" Silence. Dawes snarled, raised his hand as if to cuff the boy silent, but the mule stepped forward, stubborn and dumb, blocking Dawes with its broadside. It refused to move, wouldn't budge no matter how Dawes kicked at its belly. The boy laughed once more, just enough sound to crack the fear strung tight through Eliza's chest. A small defiance, a hairline fracture in the power that had once owned her. Nantan touched her wrist, a single squeeze. "Wait," it said without words. "Wait." When the boy's laughter died back into the hush of wind through cottonwood leaves, Dawes lowered his hand, though the threat in it didn't drain away. He spat near the mule's hooves, shot the child a look that promised he'd remember his mother's name come nightfall. But the mule refused to yield, its big shaggy shoulder blocking the trail like a dumb sentry placed by some trickster god. And while Dawes cursed and shoved, Eliza felt the shape of Nantan's plan settle over her like a rough blanket, uncomfortable, scratchy, but warm enough to mean living through dawn. Nantan's fingers left her wrist. He stepped out from the ruin's shadows, so quiet she didn't feel the moment shift, until he was already halfway across the clearing, a ghost given flesh and boot leather. He kept his hands low, loose, as though he were just another drifter crossing paths with men who'd lost the trail. Dawes turned, his teeth showing white in that half-snarled grin. One of the other men, a thin scarecrow of a rider with patchy whiskers, lifted his rifle half-heartedly but didn't shoulder it yet. "Well, look who crawled out from under a rock," Dawes drawled, pretending he hadn't flinched when Nantan first stepped out. "You think this ends any way but with your scalp on my belt, Apache?" Nantan didn't answer with words. He tilted his head, dark eyes flicking from Dawes' boots to the boy standing behind the mule, then back to Dawes' gun hand, just a flicker, enough to read the game. The wind caught his coat, fluttered the beadwork at his collar like a warning rattle. Then the world cracked open like dry kindling. The thin man's rifle barked once, a thunderclap that sent the mule braying into the brush. But Nantan was already moving, a blade in his palm like it had grown from the bone of his wrist. He hit the rifleman first, slamming the knife hilt deep under the man's ribs. The shot went wild, splintering a branch a foot above Eliza's head. Dawes lunged, pulling his pistol, but he was clumsy with rage. Nantan spun away from the dying man's grip, grabbed Dawes by the wrist, and slammed him sideways into the adobe wall where Eliza had hidden moments before. The pistol dropped, clattered across sun-baked dirt. She could taste her own breath, ragged, sour. Her knees wanted to buckle, but her fingers found a broken length of mission timber at her feet, splintered, sun-bleached, sharp at one end like a stake in an old ghost story. Dawes fought like a pinned rattler, howling curses. His spittle sprayed Nantan's cheek as he slammed elbows, knees, anything he could twist free. The boy, that tiny spark of defiance, had vanished back into the brush with the mule. The only witness left the cloud of startled crows lifting black into the morning sky. Nantan wrestled Dawes down, knee to his chest, one hand on his throat. But Dawes was bigger, fueled by rage and fear in equal measure. He bucked up, teeth snapping at the air like an animal. That was when Eliza moved, not because she was brave, but because she'd run out of any other road to run. She raised the broken timber, both hands shaking, the weight of it awkward as a lie half told. Dawes saw her then, eyes wide, surprise first, then mockery twisting his mouth even as he choked for breath under Nantan's knee. "Bride," he wheezed, voice bubbling. "Still yours." She drove the stake down, not clean, not strong, but enough. It caught his collarbone, skidded off, sank somewhere soft. The sound was not a scream but a grunt, human and not human. Dawes bucked once more. Then the fight drained out of him all at once, like water poured into sand. Eliza fell backward, gasping, staring at the blood spattered across her fingers. Her breath hitched in her ribs, no room for regret. Not now, not ever again. Nantan's hand found hers, rough, warm, grounding. He didn't smile, didn't praise her. He just squeezed once, as if to say, "You did what had to be done, and maybe that was enough." Behind them, the arroyo waited, and the sun climbed higher over the ruin. They were not done yet, she knew that in her marrow. But the first cut had been made. The old rope was burning, fiber by fiber. They did not linger by the mission. Dawes lay sprawled in the red dirt, the blood already drawing flies in lazy spirals. The thin rifleman who'd shot wild was face down near the cottonwoods, silent, his boots pointing toward nowhere. The boy and his stubborn mule were long gone, like ghosts that slip between the ribs of the living. Nantan wasted no words. He cleaned his blade on Dawes's coat, then knelt beside Eliza where she'd sunk into the dirt, shaking. He pressed a canteen to her mouth, tin cold against her cracked lips. She drank because he tipped it, because her throat still held the echo of the scream she hadn't let loose. "You walk now," he said when she'd had enough. It wasn't unkind, just truth. The kind that didn't flinch at the ruin they'd made behind them. Eliza found her feet. They felt new, raw things, not quite hers. She wiped her hands on her shredded skirts. The blood didn't come off entirely. Some of it was under her nails, staining the gold chain that still looped her throat. Her mother's locket tapped her collarbone with every ragged breath, a heartbeat of another life. She watched Nantan drag Dawes by the boots to the edge of the clearing. He didn't bury him. He didn't mark him either, just dropped the body where the coyotes would find it first. The broken timber stake stuck out like a flag in the dawn. She half expected him to say a prayer, some word for the dead, even a curse. But Nantan only looked at the corpse the way a hawk looks at a snake it's killed. Nothing left to discuss. They mounted up the roan for her, the black gelding for him. The horses shifted under the weight, restless with the stink of gunpowder and blood still lingering on their riders' boots. Nantan checked the horizon again. South. Dust. Rose faint and far, the rest of Dawes's men maybe, or worse things yet. He clicked his tongue and turned them north into the hills, where the arroyos cut deep and the cottonwoods gave way to rock and scrub pine. For a while, there was only the sound of hooves on shale. Eliza felt every step like a bruise inside her bones, but the shaking in her hands quieted. Something inside her, a tight coil of dread and obedience, lay broken back there by the ruin. In its place was only the raw taste of doing what needed doing. By mid-afternoon, they came to a high ridge where the trail turned to stone. Below lay a dry basin, cracked and shimmering with false water. On the far side, the hills rose like folded blankets, purple in the heat haze, their shadows hiding whatever might come next. They stopped at the ridge's edge. The wind lifted her hair off her neck, cooling sweat she hadn't noticed. Nantan dismounted first, slipped to the ground with the same silent grace that had carried him through men and ruin alike. He motioned her down, too. She obeyed, stiffly, feeling every torn thread of her wedding dress snag on the saddle as she swung her leg over. They stood there together, two shapes balanced on the edge of a world that had decided they didn't belong to it anymore. Nantan crouched by a flat stone. From a pouch at his hip he pulled something small, a square scrap of rawhide, dark with ash. He set it on the stone and unwrapped it. Inside, the broken horseshoe brand from the trading post. She stared at it, at the iron curled now like a question mark. "No mark," he said, echoing the words he'd given her once already. But now he struck a match, a single flick that caught against the wind, stubborn as breath in a dying man's lungs. He held the flame to the scrap. The rawhide caught first, curling black and greasy. The iron hissed as the heat cracked what was left of its shape. They watched it together, the last bit of Ropian brand life burning down to ash between them. When it was gone, he used the flat of his palm to scatter the ashes into the wind. The breeze carried them off the ridge, down into the basin. Dust to dust, claim to no claim, shame to no shame. Eliza felt her shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. Not safe yet, never safe, but lighter in the bones. She looked at Nantan, at the smoke smudge on his wrist where the match had licked him. "Why me?" she asked, voice small but steady. He looked at her then, eyes old as these hills, and shrugged once the smallest gesture. His English was soft as grit under a door. "Because you run," he said. "You burn your own rope." And for a moment the wind between them smelled only of cedar smoke and faraway rain. They rode down from the ridge at dusk, slipping into the basin where the shadows pooled thicker than water. The trail narrowed to a game path, no more than a scratch between mesquite and thornbrush. Coyotes called from somewhere to the east, a thin, lonely sound that slipped under Eliza's skin and curled there like a warning. By the time they reached the canyon's mouth, the moon had found them a pale coin caught on the jagged rim above. The walls rose sheer on both sides, sandstone stained rust and bone, carved by wind older than any name she'd ever worn. Nantan led them into the dark throat of it without a word. The horses' hooves echoed off the rock, soft at first, then louder, until every footfall sounded like it belonged to a whole company of ghosts riding behind them. Eliza's body ached with each jolt of the saddle. Her hands, raw from the broken timber and the miles of holding tight, throbbed in the cool night air. She stared down at them in the moonlight, skin torn at the knuckles, blood dry in the nail beds. Dawes's blood. Her blood. It didn't matter anymore whose it had started as. Nantan pulled them to a stop, where the canyon widened a little, just enough for a small pool fed by a trickle of spring water, weeping from the rock face. He slid off the gelding first, then came to her, hands raised not as a question but as a fact. Down now. She let him help her this time without flinching. The water was clear but bitter cold. She knelt beside it, cupping handfuls to her mouth. The ache in her wrists protested, but she didn't care. She scrubbed Dawes' rust from her skin until it stung clean. When she looked up, Nantan had settled the horses against the canyon wall, looping their reins through a twist of sage. He returned with a small bundle, his pack unwrapped on a flattish rock. From it he drew out strips of cloth torn from an old shirt, the edges ragged but clean enough. He nodded at her hands. She hesitated. He waited. Finally, she held them out, palms up, wrists slack. She'd never let a man touch her wounds before. not without something demanded in trade. But his hands were steady, his fingers rough but careful, as he wound the cloth around each split knuckle. "Why do you help me?" she asked, the words cracking the hush between canyon walls. He tied off the last bandage with his teeth. Saturday, back on his haunches, studying her face like it was a map he'd only half read. "I lost my woman," he said. The English came slow, pushed out like river stones turned in a hand. "Army took her. Said she was enemy. She was no enemy." The canyon walls swallowed his voice, gave it back softer. She wanted to say, "I'm sorry," but it felt thin in her mouth. Instead, she said, "I would have run too." His mouth twitched. Almost a smile, but not quite. He looked past her then, to the pool, to the narrow stars caught in the water's skin. "You run," he said again, like it explained the whole world. Maybe it did. They ate together, sharing the last scraps of dried meat and hard bread. The canyon breeze smelled of sage and dust, and something sweeter buried under the stone, wild mint maybe, or the memory of rain. She lay down on her side near the fire he coaxed to life from dry twigs. The flames threw shadows up the canyon walls, wild shapes that danced like things half alive. Above them, the rope was ash on the wind. The brand was gone, buried in the dirt and carried by the basin's breath. But the mark inside her, the small thing that refused to bend again, burned brighter now than any iron could hope to claim. Before her eyes closed, she saw him sitting with his back to her, knife in his lap, eyes on the canyon mouth where the night kept its secrets. For the first time since the silk dress had been buttoned over her skin, she felt sleep come without shame dogging its heels. By dawn, the fire had burned down to cold stones, and the canyon walls were just ribs of pale rock catching the first slant of sun. Eliza woke stiff, her neck bent wrong against her own arm, the bandages on her knuckles tight with dried blood. Nantan was gone from where he'd kept watch. For a heartbeat, panic caught her chest, left Mebut, then she heard it. The soft clatter of hooves, the low murmur of his voice. She crawled to her knees, peered past the boulders. He was down by the spring, brushing the roan's mane, whispering something into its twitching ear like an old secret. A breeze stirred the canyon mouth. She tasted grit on her tongue, the smell of damp stone and the faint sweetness of wild mint, still clinging to her hair from where she'd slept. She touched the locket at her throat, cold against her collarbone, a habit now like checking her own pulse. When he came back up the slope, he handed her a scrap of jerky, hard as a stone but rich with salt that made her mouth flood. She chewed while he packed their meager belongings. Saddle blanket, his knife, the last twist of dried food. He did not hurry, but she felt the urgency coiled under his skin like a snake in cold grass. "Where are we going?" she asked when he lifted her onto the mare. Her legs burned where the saddle rubbed raw places deeper. She bit the pain down with the jerky. He swung onto the gelding, his silhouette black against the sun climbing the rim of the canyon. "Old place," he said. "Stone remembers, we hide there." That was all. No map, no promise. Just the canyon opening ahead, a dry cut winding deeper than she'd guessed when they first entered its mouth. They rode in silence while the sun rose full behind them, driving the shadows deeper under overhangs where swallows flitted like scraps of dusk that hadn't left yet. She counted their wing beats to keep her mind clear. 1, 2, 3, 30, until the counting failed to hold back the worry that gnawed at her chest. "More men will come," she said. It wasn't a question. Dawes was gone, but Dawes was only one snake in a nest she'd disturbed. The ranch owner her owner, in the eyes of papers signed in courthouse dust, would send new dogs to sniff her out. Nantan did not look back. He only nodded once, slow as old stone shifting. "They come," he said. "Stone keeps you." Hours later, the canyon narrowed to a place where the horses had to pick their way single file. She felt the stone closing around the marred and ochre walls so close she could brush her fingertips across both sides if she leaned from the saddle. Then the passage widened again, not wide enough for an army, but wide enough for 2 horses. A fire, a hiding place. At its center stood a low ruin older than the mission, older maybe than any town carved by white men's hands. Just stacked rock half buried by wind and time. Its doorway, a black mouth yawning into shadow. He dismounted first, held up his hand for her to wait. She watched him step through the stone threshold, eyes narrowed, back hunched a little like he expected something to bite. A crow burst from the ruin's roofless edge, croaked once, then vanished into the high blue. When he stepped back out, he motioned her forward. She slid off the roan, her boots hitting sand that smelled faintly of ash. Inside, the ruin's air was cool, heavy with the memory of old fires. Handprints darkened the wall's faded outlines where someone long dead had marked their passing. She traced one with her finger small, no bigger than her palm. He crouched by the hearth in the ruin's center, clearing away drifted sand. There, under a flat stone, lay a circle of white shell beads strung on rawhide memory, stashed away, where the living and the dead might still share breath. He lifted the beads, cradled them in his palm. Eyes shuddered against whatever past they belonged to. Then he placed them carefully around her neck, alongside her mother's locket, two truths. One old, one new. She touched them both. Shell, gold. Her mother's hair. His people's promise. He did not speak of it, nor did she. Some marks were meant to be worn quietly, like the weight of a life not yet claimed by fire or rope. Outside, the sun moved west. Inside the ruin, the stone remembered for both of them. They stayed in the ruin 3 days, or maybe 4. Time in the canyon slipped through her fingers, like the fine sand she found in the cracks of the old hearth. Outside, the wind shifted the sun from rim to rim, dragging shadows across the stone walls until they looked like old scars that never quite healed. By the second night, the ache in her hands dulled to a steady throb. The bandages Nantan had wrapped turned dark with sweat and dust, but she kept them clean in the spring pool when he showed her how cupped water. Gentle scrub, new cloth, torn from the inside lining of her ruined wedding dress. She felt the small rebellion in that. Silk turned to bandage, beauty turned to survival. Nantan hunted where the canyon widened to scrubland. He brought back a rabbit, skinned and cooked over a fire that snapped loud enough to drown out the voices of men she imagined still chasing her name. They ate side by side, his shoulder a silent promise at her back, neither tender nor harsh, only there. One dawn she found him crouched at the ruin's low threshold, tracing the dust with a stick. He drew the same mark she'd seen back at the trading post, a circle split by 2 lines. She knelt beside him, pressing her knees into cold grit. "What does it mean?" she asked. Her voice no longer rasped, it carried steady, a thing she'd taken back piece by piece. He didn't answer right away. He brushed his thumb across the mark until it smudged into nothing. "Old sign," he said finally. "Woman who runs. Woman who lives." She let that settle into the hollow under her ribs where fear used to root itself. Her eyes drifted to the ruin's wall, those faint handprints that reached up toward a roof long gone. She pressed her palm beside them, matching ghost to ghost, a new mark to join the old. On the 4th day, the wind changed. He smelled it, first lifted his head from where he was tying the gelding's lead rope to a mesquite stump. "Men come," he said. No fear in it, just the truth laid out flat. Eliza stood, the ruined stones warm against her back where the sun had already begun to claim the morning chill. She did not feel the same terror that had choked her throat in Silverjack's trading post. Instead, something coiled inside her, not dread but readiness. She had burned the rope. She had buried the brand. There was nothing left for them to take that she wouldn't force them to bleed for. She touched the locket, the shell beads, one from a mother long dead, one from a people who remembered when stone was stronger than iron. She would not bow her head this time. When the riders came into Viewa's smear of dust against the basin's far rim, Nantan did not tell her to run. He only looked at her once. A single nod that felt like the handing over of something that could not be spoken. She stepped from the ruin first, the old silk hem whipping against her calves, bare feet anchored in grit. The canyon's mouth framed her like a doorway she'd choose to walk through on her own terms. She heard the first gunshot echo down the stone, rib-sharp, distant, a promise of iron and blood. She did not flinch. Behind her, Nantan moved forward, no louder than the hush of an old prayer. Together they waited, 2 figures in a place where the wind remembered every voice that had ever begged or cursed or sung here. She wondered if the stone would remember hers too. When the riders crested the ridge, she did not lower her chin. She did not plead. She stood with her mark burned into the dirt and her mother's ghost at her throat. Some ropes stay burned, she thought. Some brands stay buried. Some women keep running until the stone itself says, "Enough." The canyon wind caught her hair, lifted it around her face like a banner torn free. Behind her, Nantan's shadow stretched long beside her own. And when the guns came close, When the men thought they'd come for a runaway bride and found something else waiting, Eliza Carr did not pray for mercy. She let the canyon carry her name the way it carried the bones of the ones who'd come before, an echo that did not beg forgiveness, only survival. When the dust settled, when the fire died, when the guns lay still, there would be marks left behind. A handprint, a circle, split by two lines, a locket in the dirt if it slipped free. Proof enough that once a woman ran, and the desert did not eat her whole.